So let's go ahead and talk about the Samsung Galaxy S20 FE and see how this phone still holds up in 2023. Now, this device, in my opinion, I think is not only very, very popular, but a lot of people are still, surprised or, wondering about this phone because it was a pretty solid phone when Samsung officially made it back in 2020. Now, if you want to pick up this phone or some other phones I would recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there. You can help support the channel at the same time. Now, the funny thing is with the Samsung Galaxy S20 FE, the concept of this phone I think was very, very good. It was a cheaper model of their main flagship, and I think it kind of stemmed from the S10e, like that Galaxy S10e, and I think this was a very smart choice from Samsung. I think the FE lineup, the Fan Edition, is a very, very good lineup. I hope they don't remove it. The S21 FE came out last year, and that was a very, very good phone. And with the S20 FE, this was another originator of this lineup. Now, on the front and on the outside, like I said, the main thing about this phone, the reason why it was even made, was that it was supposed to be like a cheaper model of the S20, but they didn't want to skimp out on too many crazy features. This phone actually gave us a bigger display than the S20, the standard one, which was actually very interesting, but it definitely cut some corners here and there, which is expected. On the front of this phone, we have a 6.5-inch Super AMOLED display. It's a 120Hz panel, and 1080p, and overall, it is a decent panel for sure. Now, it's definitely not the greatest panel of all time. The S20 has a way better panel than this thing, but I do think for the price tag and what this phone was kind of going for, I don't really think it's that big of a deal. But I do think if you had the opportunity of actually getting the S20 or S21, maybe the S21's panel is kind of more similar to this, but the S20's panel, in my opinion, was definitely better than this one, but totally okay. This was cheaper than that phone, and it's totally understandable in my opinion. You still had the hole punch display on the top, no curved display or anything like that, but I think it still looks okay, and I'm not really complaining about it too much. On the bottom, you have that, USB-C port that does have Samsung DeX. So that's something that's really cool if you want to go and plug in, a little thing at the bottom. You also have the micro SD card slot on this phone too, which, like I mentioned before, is a really cool feature. Having that type of capability in this day and age is amazing, and that's something that we really don't have on a lot of phones anymore. We had that on this device back then, which I think is amazing. So, in my opinion, I do have to give, again, Samsung a ton of credit in that specific area because it was one of the coolest things that they actually ended up doing. So, in my opinion, a thumbs up for me for keeping that micro SD card slot on this phone. Now, on top of that, you had a plastic bag on this phone. So this is the one thing that kind of threw me off. Samsung actually called it a Galactic bag, which is kind of a little corny, I have to be honest. But I will tell you, with this type of product and with this type of phone, I mean, when you have a case on it and everything, it doesn't feel as bad. But again, if you're rocking something like the Galaxy S20, standard one, you will see that that one definitely feels a lot more premium than this thing. But again, I don't want to harp on just the plastic back way too long, but it is kind of annoying. But you still have wireless charging on this phone, and you have reverse wireless charging as well, which I think is awesome. Now, on top of that, you do have the triple camera setup on the top left corner, which, as I mentioned before, is really cool. Having that, triple camera setup is always a nice touch, and I always like having 3 cameras rather than just 1 or 2. So, in terms of that, it kind of covers up everything on the outside. Now, on the camera department, as I mentioned before, triple camera setup on the back. You had a 12 megapixel wide angle lens, 8 megapixel telephoto lens, then a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera. Then you also had a 32 megapixel front facing wide angle lens. Now, I do think the front camera isn't really as great as you would think. 4K at 60 on the front and the back is awesome, but that is a very high megapixel count to what you're going to assume this camera is going to output. But I will tell you, the back camera of this thing is pretty decent. The only issues I kind of have is zooming in and zooming out and going throughout the whole entire UI of the camera can be a little bit of a choppy experience. But I do think for a day-to-day camera, this thing is very good. You have a ton of features built into this camera, and I think that in and of itself is really cool. I can just pick up this phone and just kind of use it, and I have a great experience. I have a great time with it. Like I mentioned, it's not the perfect camera of all time, and it's definitely not flawless, but I do think if you're trying to go ahead and use a camera, you're going to be fine with the back camera. The front camera I think is okay, like I said, but it's definitely not the greatest front camera of all time. Also, if you're trying to use other applications like Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, those apps aren't really as optimized as you would think for these specific phones. So that might be something you might want to consider, but regardless, it gets a thumbs up for me too. It's a pretty decent camera. Now, in the software and the longevity department, this phone did end up getting One UI 5. I still have yet to get One UI 5 on any of my phones besides my Galaxy S22. So it's very, very weird, but regardless, I'll tell you, this is probably going to be one of its last updates. And I think that's kind of expected. When you have a phone that's kind of this old and of this caliber, I think it's a really cool thing that this phone has going for. I'm glad that this thing has, gotten as many updates as it has, but it's kind of sad. I'm not too sure if it's going to be lasting longer. We're going to have to wait and see, but I think even in this point, it's still a good, phone. It still has a lot of features built in. I just wish, one thing is, I wish these phones lasted longer, which they've been doing. But I also wish that Samsung would just push out all the updates at the same time. If you want to go and update your phone, you can go and, just do it if you want to. If an update is available, you can get it. You don't have to wait for the carrier. You don't have to wait for anything. This update has been out for like a few months now or something, and I'm still not getting it on my phone, which is very, very annoying. So I wish Samsung were to fix it, but I guess we're going to have to wait and see what happens there. Now in the performance department, this phone has that Qualcomm Snapdragon 865 chipset inside of it, with 6 gigs of RAM on the base model and 8 gigabytes of RAM on the top tier model. Now, as I mentioned before, for a long period of time, this type of phone, in my opinion, is pretty good in the performance front. I think if you're going through and just using this phone as a gaming console in a way, or if you're doing it for day-to-day tasks, you're going to have a wide range of things you can do with this phone. For one, as I mentioned before, if you're doing very basic things like texting and calling people on Snapchat and TikTok, you're going to be fine. You're not going to be missing out on anything in that front. But if you are playing, if you're going up a notch and playing intensive games like Genshin Impact or PUBG or Call of Duty Mobile or any of those types of games, you may also get to see that this type of experience is also pretty good. And the fact that we have the ability of tuning down the graphics if the games are too graphical for those phones, you can also do that here too. So there's really not a whole lot to complain about in that specific situation either. So I think the performance of this phone is pretty good if you don't, think about, oh, this phone is so much slower than my Galaxy S22 or my Z Fold 4 or whatever the case is. Of course, this phone is not going to be as fast as those phones, but I think it still does a pretty good job. And if I had to use this phone on an everyday basis, I would be perfectly fine. I don't think I would complain about the performance at all with this phone. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. In the battery department, 4500 mAh battery, and I do think this is another pretty good area of this phone too. That is a massive size battery to have on a phone like this. It's a pretty big phone, but it also has a pretty big battery, which is nice. The display is really, it's only 1080p, which is still really good, and it's not like a crazy 1440p panel, so I've had pretty good battery life on my previous S20 FE and even this one, and I think it's totally okay for the most part. If you want to buy this phone, you're going to be in a pretty good performing to battery life ratio, in my opinion. So to kind of sum up this entire video, what I'll tell you is that I think the Galaxy S20 FE is still a very good phone. It's still very much worth it. I will tell you though, if you have the money, I would recommend going up to the Galaxy S21 FE though. From my experience, that phone is definitely better than this thing, but I think the S20 FE still sits in a really good spot where it's a fairly cheap phone to buy. It's really not like overly expensive or anything, and it still, is a very capable phone. I think a lot of people can, buy this phone and still use it on an everyday basis. I think Galaxy S20s are also fairly cheap now in the used market, so you can probably pick them up from there too, but that's pretty much how this phone holds up in 2023. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.